In the spring of 2025, something unexpected began happening inside Russia. Voices that had once cheered the loudest for war, that had demanded total victory and scorned any talk of compromise, started to change their tune. These were not dissidents or opposition figures. These were the hardcore supporters, the ultranationalists, the so-called Z-Patriots who had wrapped themselves in the symbols of military aggression. And now some of them were saying the unthinkable. Russia cannot win this war. Among these voices, one stands out with particular force. Maxim Kalashnikov, a pro-war commentator and blogger who had built his reputation on fierce nationalism and unwavering support for what the Kremlin calls the special military operation, published a forecast that sent shockwaves through Russian social media. His words were blunt and devastating. The war against Ukraine, he wrote, had already undermined Russia economically and would lead to severe long-term consequences that the country might never recover from. More striking still, he argued that ending the war was now inevitable, not because of military defeat on the battlefield, but because continuing would mean complete financial collapse. This was not the language of defeatism from the margins. This was coming from inside the tent, from someone who had championed the war effort and attacked those who questioned it. Kalashnikov's assessment painted a picture of Russia as a nation that had gambled everything on a swift victory and now faced the consequences of a protracted conflict it could not afford to continue. He described the decision to turn what was supposed to be a quick operation into a 4-year meat grinder as a surefire failure, a strategic catastrophe that had drained the country's resources and left it vulnerable on every front. The numbers Kalashnikov cited were staggering. He predicted Russia's federal budget would remain in deficit until at least 2042, nearly 2 decades of financial strain that no amount of tax increases could resolve. In his view, raising taxes would only deepen the economic downturn, creating a vicious cycle where the government extracted more from an already struggling population while providing less in return. This was not a temporary setback, he argued, but a fundamental restructuring of Russia's economic reality, one that would leave the country permanently weakened. What made Kalashnikov's warnings particularly potent was his willingness to compare Russia's current trajectory to its own history. He invoked the specter of 1991, the year the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. That comparison was not accidental. For many Russians, especially those of Kalashnikov's generation, the dissolution of the Soviet Empire represented the greatest humiliation of their lifetimes, a moment when a superpower fractured into pieces and lost its place on the world stage. To suggest that Russia was heading toward a similar fate was to touch the rawest nerve in the national psyche. But Kalashnikov went further. He described contemporary Russia as a ship with a breached hull and broken masts, barely staying afloat. Every bit of energy, every resource would have to be devoted simply to survival, to keeping the vessel from sinking entirely. There would be nothing left for advancement, for competing in the global innovation race that was accelerating around the world. While other nations invested in technology, infrastructure, and human capital, Russia would be stuck in emergency mode, patching holes and bailing water. This economic analysis led Kalashnikov to an even more damning conclusion about Russia's position in the world. The country risked falling hopelessly behind not just the obvious competitors like the United States and China, but also emerging powers like India and Turkey. This was a particularly bitter pill for Russian nationalists to swallow. The idea that Turkey, a NATO member and historical rival, might surpass Russia in technological and economic development challenged fundamental assumptions about Russia's place in the global hierarchy. The notion that India, often viewed through a Cold War lens as a partner or junior ally, could leapfrog ahead was equally troubling. Kalashnikov's criticism extended beyond economics to the very system of governance that had led Russia into this predicament. He described the current government as characterized by unimaginable inertia and short-sightedness, qualities that made it incapable of responding to the crisis it had created. The state apparatus, in his view, had rusted through with corruption and inertia, becoming a barrier to adaptation rather than an instrument of progress. This was a direct indictment of the decision-making structure around Vladimir Putin, though Kalashnikov was careful in how he phrased his critique. The vision Kalashnikov painted of Russia's future was bleak. He saw the country regressing to something resembling a 19th-century agrarian and raw materials empire, extracting wealth from the ground, but unable to transform it into modern economic power. This would be a Russia permanently on the periphery, selling oil and gas and wheat to more advanced nations, while falling further behind in every measure that mattered for 21st-century competition. It would be a Russia with nuclear weapons and a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, but without the economic foundation to sustain superpower status. What Kalashnikov explicitly ruled out was any prospect of escalation into a broader war. Despite all the rhetoric from Russian state television about confrontation with NATO, despite the constant invocation of World War III scenarios, Kalashnikov acknowledged a reality that many inside Russia understood but few would say publicly. Moscow's forces were already exhausted. There would be no great showdown with Europe, no expansion of the conflict beyond Ukraine's borders. Russia had already committed what it could afford to commit, and even that was proving unsustainable. Yet Kalashnikov did not predict a smooth transition to peace. He foresaw what he called very large and dangerous turbulence ahead, a period of instability and upheaval that could reshape Russia as dramatically as the collapse of the Soviet Union had done. This turbulence would not come from external enemies, but from internal contradictions, from the gap between the promises made to the Russian people and the reality they would face when the war ended and the bills came due. Kalashnikov's public statements represented something larger than one commentator's change of heart. They reflected a growing fracture within the pro-war coalition that had seemed so unified in the early months of the conflict. The Z-Patriots, named for the letter that became the symbol of Russia's military operation in Ukraine, had emerged as vocal cheerleaders for maximum aggression. They had attacked the Kremlin not for prosecuting the war, but for not prosecuting it aggressively enough, demanding total mobilization and the use of any means necessary to achieve victory. They had shown no patience for negotiations, no sympathy for Ukrainian civilians, no concern about international isolation or economic consequences. But as the war dragged into its third year, and now its fourth, as the casualty lists grew longer and the promised quick victory never materialized, some of these ultranationalists began to reassess. They watched as sanctions bit deeper than the Kremlin had predicted, as foreign companies withdrew and supply chains broke down. They saw inflation erode savings and living standards, even as the government poured ever more resources into the military. They heard reports from the front lines that contradicted official claims of steady progress and minimal losses, and gradually, some began to speak more openly about their concerns. This shift became particularly visible among Russian military bloggers, a loose network of often anonymous commentators who had gained large followings by providing supposedly insider perspectives on the war. These millbloggers, as they came to be known, had initially served as amplifiers for military success stories and critics of any perceived weakness in the prosecution of the war. But as the conflict continued, their tone changed. They began to criticize specific military decisions, to question the competence of commanders, to point out logistical failures and strategic mistakes. Some went further, suggesting that the problems went beyond individual errors to systemic failures in how Russia organized and supplied its forces. The Kremlin found itself in a difficult position. These critics were not liberal opposition voices that could be easily dismissed or suppressed. They were nationalists, patriots by their own definition, people who claimed to support Russia's aims even as they criticized the means being used to achieve them. Silencing them too harshly risked alienating a crucial base of support, but allowing the criticism to spread unchecked threatened to undermine public confidence in the war effort and in the leadership directing it. By late 2024 and into 2025, the criticism from pro-war voices had become impossible to ignore. Reports emerged of ultranationalists turning on Putin himself, something that would have been unthinkable in the war's first year. The Guardian documented this phenomenon, noting how figures who had once been among Putin's most reliable supporters were increasingly blaming him personally for the war's failures. This represented a fundamental breakdown in the narrative that had sustained Russian public support for the conflict. The idea that Putin was a strong leader, making difficult but necessary decisions in the face of Western aggression. The economic data supported the pessimistic assessments coming from critics like Kalashnikov. Independent analysis showed Russia's war economy under severe strain, with budget deficits widening and the government increasingly reliant on one-time revenues from selling off reserves and raiding sovereign wealth funds. The Washington Post detailed how Russia was burning through financial buffers that were meant to sustain the country through future crises, spending them instead on current military operations. The Financial Times tracked how Russia was losing ground in the global technology race, cut off from advanced semiconductors and other critical components that modern economies depend on. RBC Ukraine reported that the war was pushing Russia's economy toward a critical threshold, a point where the accumulated damage would become impossible to reverse through any feasible policy changes. This analysis aligned with Kalashnikov's warnings about long-term consequences extending decades into the future. The structure of the Russian economy was being fundamentally altered, with military production crowding out civilian industries and the best resources flowing to sustaining the war effort rather than building future prosperity. Some of the most stark assessments came from Meduza, an independent Russian news outlet operating from exile. Their analysts described a Russian economy that had been reorganized entirely around the war, with consequences that would persist long after any peace agreement. Workers had been pulled from productive industries into uniform or into factories making weapons. Capital that might have been invested in modernization was instead being consumed in combat. International partnerships that had taken decades to build had been severed, and rebuilding them would require not just policy changes, but a fundamental reorientation of Russia's relationship with the world. Reuters documented the growing exhaustion visible in Russia's economic indicators, from labor shortages to inflation that persisted despite the central bank's efforts to control it. The wartime economy was running hot, with unemployment at record lows, but this was not a sign of health. It reflected a situation where every available worker was needed, where there was no spare capacity, no buffer for the unexpected. It was an economy operating at maximum stress, and the longer it continued, the more damage would accumulate. Even in Hindi-language media, where coverage of the Ukraine war had often been less detailed than in Western outlets, analysts were beginning to pay attention to Russia's economic trajectory. BBC Hindi and Deutsche Welle Hindi both ran features examining the long-term costs Russia was incurring, noting that the country's population would ultimately bear the burden through reduced living standards and diminished opportunities. These reports reached audiences in India, a country that had maintained careful neutrality on the war, but whose own economic relationship with Russia was substantial. The Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank that had been tracking the conflict closely, noted the significance of the growing criticism from Russian millbloggers and nationalist commentators. Their analysis suggested this represented a genuine shift in Russian public discourse, not merely tactical criticism designed to push for more aggressive action, but fundamental questioning of whether the war's goals were achievable at acceptable cost. Al Jazeera similarly reported on pro-war voices turning critical, framing it as a potential inflection point in Russian domestic politics. What made these developments particularly significant was the context in which they were occurring. Russia in early 2025 was not facing imminent military collapse on the battlefield. Its forces, while having failed to achieve decisive breakthrough, maintained control of substantial Ukrainian territory. But the criticism from figures like Kalashnikov suggested that military stalemate, combined with economic decline, was creating a political crisis. The question being asked, implicitly or explicitly, was whether Putin's leadership had led Russia into a strategic dead end from which there was no good exit. Kalashnikov's call for Russians to prepare for major upheavals resonated because it captured a growing sense that the country was approaching a moment of reckoning. For years, the Russian government had managed to maintain a sense of normalcy in major cities, ensuring that while the war dominated headlines, daily life continued without dramatic disruption for most citizens. But the economic strains were becoming harder to hide. Inflation was eroding purchasing power. The ruble's value fluctuated wildly. Certain goods were becoming difficult to obtain. The contrast between official assurances and lived experience was widening. The comparison to 1991 that Kalashnikov and others invoked carried particular weight because that collapse had come suddenly, after years of gradual deterioration that officials had insisted was manageable. The Soviet Union had appeared solid until quite suddenly it wasn't, fragmenting in a matter of months after decades of apparent stability. The parallel was uncomfortable because it suggested that Russia's current troubles might not lead to gradual adjustment, but to sudden crisis, a moment when accumulated pressures overcame the system's ability to contain them. What remained unclear was what form such upheaval might take. Kalashnikov did not spell out whether he expected political change, economic collapse, regional fragmentation, or some combination of these. The vagueness was probably intentional, allowing readers to project their own concerns onto his warnings. But the message was unmistakable. The current trajectory was unsustainable, and something would have to give. The Kremlin's response to these criticisms was muted. There were no high-profile arrests of military bloggers, no harsh crackdowns on nationalist commentators. This restraint likely reflected recognition that suppressing these voices would only validate their concerns and risk alienating a constituency that remained broadly supportive of Russia's national interests, even as it questioned current tactics. Instead, state media attempted to counter the pessimism with reports of military progress and economic resilience, though these assurances seemed increasingly disconnected from the accounts emerging from both the front lines and the home front. By the spring of 2025, as Kalashnikov's warnings circulated widely on Russian social media and were picked up by Ukrainian and Western outlets, they represented something more than one commentator's opinion. They crystallized a broader shift in how at least some segment of Russian society was thinking about the war and its consequences. The narrative of inevitable victory, of Russia's strength prevailing over Western opposition, was being challenged not from outside but from within the nationalist camp itself. The war that was supposed to demonstrate Russia's power and resolve was instead, in the view of critics like Kalashnikov, exposing its weaknesses and accelerating its decline. The special military operation that was meant to be quick and decisive had become a grinding conflict of attrition that Russia was slowly losing not on the battlefield, but in the larger strategic competition that would shape the 21st century. And the leader who had staked his legacy on restoring Russian greatness was increasingly being blamed, even by his former supporters, for leading the country into a crisis from which it might not recover. These developments are unfolding in real time as of early 2025, with Maxim Kalashnikov's March statements representing some of the most explicit warnings yet from within Russia's pro-war community. The sources for this account include reporting from Ukrainian news outlets, Russian independent media, and Western mainstream publications including The Guardian, Washington Post, Financial Times, and Reuters, supplemented by analysis from regional media in Hindi and specialized monitoring from organizations tracking the conflict.